All right. Hello. So please state your name, your occupation, and where you live.
My name is Joshua Grannell. My occupation is performing and producing as the drag persona Peaches Christ, and I live in San Francisco.
What made you want to be a drag queen?
Um, well, I guess I didn't really ever wake up and say I want to be a drag queen. I knew as a kid I wanted to be a performer, an entertainer, and a storyteller, really more than anything. I was always drawn to making movies and putting on plays when I was a child, and being in those projects. So it wasn't until, gosh, I was like in junior high that I even was aware of what a drag queen was, or that drag queens existed. And my introduction to drag queens was through the films of John Waters, and the performances of Divine, as well as the discovery of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So then I became a fan of drag through those projects. And when I was in college and I was making a movie, there was a drag queen character in the film, and an actor was cast to play that character. And when the actor was really kind of flaky and just not showing up, and compromising our ability to finish our film and get a grade so we could graduate, I actually stepped in and played the character. So that was really the decision to become a drag queen, was first to finish a movie. Then I found that I really enjoyed being this alternate persona, and took the character and promoted the movie as the character Peaches. So my character in the movie, Jizz Mopper is what the movie's called. My character is called Peaches. And then I promoted the film as Peaches, at Penn State University, which was really quite shocking. And, people there were not drag queens there in 1995, 96 when I graduated. So when I moved to San Francisco, drag was very kind of underground still, as far as the drag I was interested in. And I decided to perform as a hobby. It was really a hobby more than anything. I never thought that I would make money doing it.
Right. How long have you been doing drag?
Well, that movie was, I started performing in that movie in drag in 1995. So however long that is. Oh my God.
20 plus years. Let's say that.
Yeah, at least.
So, when we talk about queer spaces, what were queer spaces like back then?
Well, I think especially, well, I'm lucky because I had the benefit of going to a Big Ten university smack dab in the middle of Pennsylvania, which is best known for its football team. Penn State's football team is huge. And, they have the largest fraternity and sorority group, or whatever that's called, the collection of fraternities and sororities of any university in the country. So to say it's traditional is an understatement, and to say it's in the middle of nowhere is an understatement, because the closest cities of Pittsburgh or Philadelphia were hours and hours away
Right.
by car. So we ended up in the 90s, queer kids, and adults, being so marginalized and so not closeted. I mean, we weren't closeted, but we also, it wasn't safe to be out in public. You couldn't take over public spaces the way that you could now. And so we ended up having lots of parties, and we were inspired by the film Paris is Burning to create different houses. And so there were all these different queer houses with different queer families, and the houses would throw these elaborate parties, and everyone was invited. And it was kind of like we wanted to outdo each other. So there were always themes, and people wore costumes, and they were essentially underground parties, because to stay safe, we kept the information between the queer community, or allies, of course. But I consider all those people queer in some way, because to be an ally, especially in the mid 90s in Penn State, even if you were technically heterosexual, you were basically queer. You were one of us. So when I moved to San Francisco, where being gay or queer or trans or lesbian, where the queer umbrella was really so big and there was such an established community here. San Francisco was already well established as a safe place. It was very different. Here in San Francisco at that time, it was very, I mean, my God, it was like, it was just amazing. It was like showing up in Oz, if you were Dorothy. And, sadly, there were so many more queer spaces back then than there are now, ironically. So many more nightclubs and community spaces, coffee shops, and lesbian spaces, gay spaces. It was just something I guess we took for granted at the time. But it's interesting that with progress, quote unquote, we've seen those spaces become less and less over the years.
Right. And when you talk about, you mentioned there were more queer spaces back then than now. I think a lot of people today would kind of reverse it, because I would think like, oh, back then I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of queer spaces. But what do you think made, a change? Like, what made it die out? And maybe not die out, maybe like disappear from today.
Sorry, I just realized you had your camera on.
It's okay. No, I didn't want you to force. If you didn't want to show your face, then.
Oh, I don't mind at all. I just figured,
Okay.
but when I signed on and your camera wasn't on, I just left mine off too. But then I just
totally
looked
forgot
back.
to tell you
I was
that.
like,
I'm so sorry.
oh, there they are. Okay, so I'm sorry. Say your question again. I think I got it, but I want to be sure.
When you talk about, back then, you said queer spaces, you had more queer spaces
Right.
in the 90s. What do you think made it kind of disappear to the 20th century, 2021?
Yeah.
And when you think, 2021, there's more queer spaces, but in your eyes, back then, there was more than now. What do you think made it disappear or die out?
So I think there are a few reasons. One is when I came out, there were a number of rights we still had to fight for. When I came out, we still were not allowed to be in the military. We were sort of satiated by "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" by Bill Clinton. Marriage, seemed a million years away. Marriage, the idea of a Black president, like these concepts as a progressive young queer activist, I don't even know that I thought I'd see them in my lifetime. So it is really incredible the amount of progress we've made. On the flip side, we, as you know, deal with sort of a reaction to that, which leads to conservatives being even crazier, abortion not being something we can take for granted. Like at any moment, it seems like the pendulum could swing in any which way. I'll say that, unfortunately, the sort of effect of some of this progress, including progress in technology, the internet, things like Grindr, gay marriage becoming legal, gay people being seen in the media, queer people being seen in the media, trans people now having true visibility, and all of this stuff, don't get me wrong, is awesome. It is good. I'm not saying it's bad. I think equity across the board is important. But as a young punk, I was like, fuck marriage, that's heteronormative, get rid of marriage. Now, as a maybe a more mature adult, I realized like that wasn't necessarily the best route to go. Maybe now I'll fight for the dissolution of marriage as well as gender, like that to me is like, okay, but because people were being oppressed, we fought for marriage. We fought for, the right to serve in the military, even though I have no interest in being in the military, all those things. Well, spaces that existed for our safety were no longer as necessary. Gay bars and gay nightlife, sadly, a big part of the draw wasn't just the shows us drag queens were putting on, but it was dick and the mystery of whether or not I was going to get laid, and even in San Francisco, there were women's spaces because there was no internet, and so there were coffee shops and stand-up poetry, very lesbian-led spaces and bars. The Lexington Club and the Cafe at one time was a lesbian club. People don't really know that now. When I tell young people, oh yeah, the Cafe on Market Street, that was a lesbian space. All those spaces as businesses suffered because people didn't need to go out as much. And instead of only being able to live in like the Castro or Polk Street, as far as gay neighborhoods, which by the way, Polk Street was totally gay at one time, like a completely queer neighborhood, which is not what it is now. But queer people felt safe moving anywhere, right? So you could be anywhere in the city, which meant these sort of spaces, like neighborhood spaces, where every neighborhood kind of had like, a identity, and it felt like there were places queer people lived and there were places queer people didn't live. That all changed with progress. And so what we saw was there was less need for exclusively queer spaces, especially young queer people felt comfortable hanging out with their straight peers and going into straight spaces and partying with straight people. And I think that's a good thing, but it also meant there was less need for these specifically queer spaces. And so they closed. I think they just couldn't, they couldn't afford to stay open.
Right. And then now with the pandemic, do you
Yeah.
think COVID-19 worsened queer spaces?
I think, yes, I think it's having an effect on any small business. So queer or not, I think, but because queer culture in many ways, and I think this is a good thing, is so centered around nightlife and performance spaces and creative spaces, I think those businesses almost more than anything are at risk. And so a larger majority of what would be considered queer spaces are at higher risk, bars, nightclubs, theaters, that kind of business. So, we've already seen, the Stud, while the Collective is still hoping to reopen in a physical space at some point, but, right now they don't have a home, so the Stud Bar, which was, legendary, is gone. And I could probably think of more. I know the Eagle right now is a big question mark, I've heard, oh, well, what was the one I just read about closing? The Small Bar in the Mission by El Rio. Ugh, I forget the name, but it closed recently. Anyway, yeah, I think we're gonna lose even more. It's gonna be devastating.
Right.
I will say this though, I have hope because having lived here long enough, I know that in the ashes, a phoenix can rise. And I actually think that San Francisco had become so suffocating and so problematic with the disparity of wealth. The rich were so rich and the poor were so poor. And, tech was overrunning the city and our culture was kind of like being suffocated. And you couldn't afford to go in and find spaces. You couldn't afford to open a cafe. You couldn't afford to find an art space. And now with this great exodus and sort of this huge economic crisis, people like myself may actually get excited about what's going to happen, because what has happened in the past is the creatives, the artists, the weirdos, the people who aren't afraid to live in a city right now, we're kind of experiencing the Great White Flight all over again, like they did in the 50s. So cities could become more dangerous, grosser, but way more interesting with lots more queer spaces and art and funky weird stuff that isn't profit driven.
Right. So what you're basically saying is whenever COVID gets under control, whenever COVID is done, dead, queer spaces will come back alive.
I really believe that. Yeah, and I think San Francisco, my hope is we now can start to advertise. Like I'm literally thinking of just starting to put rental listings on social media so that like queer weirdos, especially young people know, you know what? There's a place for you here now. You can move here with your friend and actually get an apartment and afford it and like build something here. Whereas 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when queer young people would email me or message me, I would be like, "Oh my God, I don't know if you should move here right now. You know, I'm worried you'll be homeless. You know, like like it costs $4,000 to live in a studio or whatever. You know, and now it's actually looking like, yeah, my partner and I keep looking at the marketplace on Facebook, and
Mhm.
we're like, is this real? You can get a studio now for like $1,200. That's amazing. So, who knows?
Have you been doing any online drag shows during COVID, or have you just been trying to take a break? Or
A little of both. So I haven't done them as aggressively as some of my friends. I've kind of used the time to develop new content. So I wrote a new screenplay with a friend, and I created a TV show with another friend, and then created a docu-series with another friend. And all those projects are now kind of like being shopped around to networks and stuff. So in between that, just to kind of pay the bills and stuff, I have done maybe like a dozen online drag shows. And I'm so grateful that we have the technology to do that. I mean, some of those shows really did like pay my bills this year. Yeah.
so when you aren't in drag, um, at these queer spaces, do you feel like there's a difference between your drag persona and just you when you're
I do. I think because I really see Peaches as sort of this very exaggerated, outgoing, you know, larger than life version of something that's inside of me, and something that was really um you know, shameful at one time because basically being a sissy, you know, growing up, especially in a conservative Catholic, you know, environment, you know, I was taught not to be like a girl. You know, I always wanted to play with girls. I like if I was I wasn't really like drawn to anything one way or the other as far as gender goes. I certainly wasn't drawn to boy stuff. You know, like I wasn't interested in sports. I wasn't interested in so the stuff I was drawn to, like theater and art, was considered girly where I grew up. And so, you know, yeah, I was shamed for that. And so I look at Peaches as this sort of like kind of big fuck you to like that and this sort of expression of all that stuff. But I think because I get to be Peaches and it sort of expresses this part of my gender identity and creativity and performance need. As Joshua, I found that I'm much more of an introvert and frumpy. You know, like I don't care about clothes or fashion. Like before I was Peaches, or before I really focused on Peaches, you know, I like really was into clothes and the way the way I presented myself, and like you know, I would would wear barrettes and sometimes would wear lipstick or whatever. Um, it's funny how like I do have these different personas. I mean, they're both me. Peaches is definitely a version of me. It's not just totally a character, but I like going through life not having to be Peaches all the time, if that makes sense.
yeah.
You know, and so Joshua's kind of the more quiet, you know, boring version of myself.
Uh, so before COVID hit, and when you were performing in these queer spaces, or maybe just in queer spaces, do you think queer spaces, for some people, is like an escape of for their life, just watching people be happy, be themselves? Do you think queer spaces mean a lot to some people just because they don't know where to go?
Absolutely. I think that for me, especially, you know, I got my start at a club in San Francisco, which was called Tranny Shack. And, you know, it was uh, I've always feel like the caveat now I have to make is, at a time when the word tranny was not the pejorative that it is now. And at the time, that club, that space it was Tuesday nights at midnight, and it was packed. But what it was, the umbrella, what that club represented was any freak who was like queer. And by queer, I mean you weren't just gay, because if you were gay, there were 15 bars in the Castro for you to go to. This was men, women, trans men, trans women, cis women, straight, gay. These were queers, like everyone had queer in common. And in a sense, we were all identifying as the T word in one way or another. And this included men and their wives coming in to San Francisco from the suburbs, where these men would wear women's clothes. And this was one of the only places where all of us, drag queens, trans women, trans men, so when I say it really was this umbrella, what we had in common in that space was when we walked out the door, the people who wanted to murder us or beat us up, even in San Francisco, even in the Bay Area, didn't give a shit that I was a drag queen and my friend Veronica was a trans woman. They didn't care. To them, we were all the same. And I loved that time. I mean, in some ways it sounds fucked up because there was a lot more oppression and a lot more to be afraid of. But the community was so bonded. And that space, that queer space, specifically that place and that space and time was, oh my God, it was like, for me, it was like, I mean, even in San Francisco, even, working a regular, like having a job, like that was the space where I could be truly me, And yeah, I think that sort of safe space, a queer space, is really important. And I guess at this point, I feel like if you are gay, maybe it's not as important as a queer safe space, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like there's a difference between being gay and being queer. So, and I would say that it's funny because Tranny Shack was at the Stud, and before it closed, I was going to shows at the Stud, like right before the pandemic. Like friends were putting on a show called The Palace of Trash, and these different events and things, and it was still the same spirit, like the same young sort of queerdos that didn't fit in the sort of mainstream gay community. We're still going to the Stud and creating, space. So I think it's really important.
All right. So I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
So have you been around the United States, like to different states, correct?
Mm-hmm.
When looking at maybe other queer spaces, not in California, do you feel like there's a big difference? Like how maybe they're set up, maybe how...
I used to think that, but I think because of the internet, I think it's really changed. And I think a lot of the, it used to be that you'd go to this place. Like I remember in college at Penn State, I was the leader, one of the directors of the student queer organization, which was called the LGBSA, the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Student Alliance. And so my friend Michael, who's the drag queen Martini that I moved to San Francisco, and we were very close with many, many trans people at Penn State, many of whom who felt very afraid, very closeted, and trans awareness, trans issues were really different. So we put a vote to the student group to add the T to the title, and it was voted down. So that pissed us off. So that whole year we programmed, all different speakers, all different workshops, all different, education, thinking we're gonna teach these dumb gay people that trans people belong. We do the vote again at the end of the year. Still no T. They voted it down. It was crazy to me. Now we moved to San Francisco and they were light years ahead of us. We go to other places and they don't even know what the T stands for. You know what I mean? Like this is like, so depending on where you were, bisexuality was controversial, you know. The idea of talking about sexism was unheard of in gay spaces, you know. So I think now, because of the internet and because young people are so much better connected and queer people have the ability to, you know, really connect, I think that the similarities are very strong, you know. I think that's a good thing, you know. I think people have progressed more. I mean, even, you know, my partner is Turkish, and we're now in touch with we're trying to, you know, help some friends of ours get out of Turkey who are, you know, really in danger because one of them is trans. And it's interesting there, the activism, the language, it's all the same, you know, and that's because of the internet. Does it now? The oppression is scarier, but the, you know, the activists are all, we're all speaking the same language.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So do you think, drag is just a big thing in America?
Yeah.
So do you think that being a drag queen changed your life? Just did you think, maybe when you're in high school, your life would be like this, like you would be one of the biggest drag queens known to be?
No, I mean, I couldn't imagine it. When I was in high school, I mean, I wanted to make horror movies. You know, I was obsessed with horror movies. I was obsessed. I did love John Waters and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but I wasn't even out in high school. Now looking back, I'm like, oh my God, everything I did, everything I liked was so gay. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't know that, like, I mean, I was openly like, I love Paris is Burning. You know, like, I didn't know that, like, people would stop calling me faggot if I like behaved differently. I didn't care. I was just who I was or whatever. But being a drag performer, it wasn't something I really ever conceived of. And I always thought that I would be working creatively. Like my dream was to like make movies and have a haunted house someday, you know, and I have both of those now. I, you know, made movies and I have a haunted house. So it's weird that those things happened. But this Peaches thing, that's kind of the bigger thing, bigger than both those things. You know, I've made a feature film starring Natasha Lyonne, but that is so not as big in people's minds as being me being Peaches Christ. To me, you know, making a big movie was like, you know, and Peaches was always this fun hobby, you know, but the fact that Peaches ended up becoming this sort of like empire for me was an accident, like a total accident. And I'll say that with the popularity of drag now, and drag being basically kind of the pumpkin latte of gay culture, you know, thanks to RuPaul's Drag Race, you know, my attraction to it was that it was transgressive, it pissed people off, it scared people, it was kind of punk rock, it was grungy, it could be ugly, you know. But now, you know, I'm kind of like, okay, whatever, drag, you know, like I'm not as excited about it because, you know, it's, I mean, in many ways, it's just very basic, you know, like it's become very mainstream for lack of a better word. So I now am trying to figure out, like, as an old queen, you know, how do I not get bitter? And I guess the way is to continue to, like, you know, push. Now I push on the young queens, you know, and I'm having fun doing it, you know. And part of my agenda is that I've always been political, and I think most of us older queens, if you look at me, Jackie, Lady Bunny, you know, Coco Peru, our drag has always had a conscience to it, you know. It was more than just entertaining. We were trying to move the dial, and so now you've got all these basic people like gay men doing drag, and we're kind of like, oh, let's call them out on their shit, you know, like, oh, that's kind of sexist what you're saying and doing, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying being kind of a little bit of a provocateur, but instead of horrifying straight people, now I'm horrifying drag queens.